Hi, I'm Delilah, and this is the story of how the man I trusted most quietly rewrote my life, one forged signature at a time. He said he was protecting me, that he just needed my signature to simplify things. But what he really did was declare me incapable, also he could build his dream on my back. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to find out they saw you as a means to an end? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a quiet betrayal that speaks volumes. I always believed that trust was the bedrock of marriage, until I learned that mine was paper thin and easily forged. The morning mist hung low over McMinnville, softening the edges of the plum blossoms just beginning to burst along the hedgerows. I sat on the front porch, with my usual cup of chamomile, the scent mingling with the faint, earthy sweetness of spring. My cane leaned against the wicker table beside me, worn at the handle from years of use, and my left foot tapped unconsciously to the rhythm of birdsong. Brent had already been up for hours. I heard him in the kitchen clattering pans, probably another one of his extravagant omelets, the kind he used to mess up royally until I taught him to separate the yolks. He emerged, bright-eyed, carrying a tray that wobbled slightly with every step. "For my miracle girl," he said, setting it in front of me like I was royalty. The eggs were slightly overcooked, but the toast had just the right crisp. He even added strawberry jam, my favorite. "You've outdone yourself," I said, smiling. He grinned, rubbing his hands together like a boy with a secret. "Delilah, I got the call this morning. The loan came through." I blinked. "For the restaurant?" "For Brent's table. The bank approved it, but there's a small gap I need to fill. Construction costs, permits. You know how it goes." The worry must have shown on my face, because he reached out and cupped my hand. His touch was gentle, warm. "I'll handle everything, sweetheart. I just need to shuffle some papers. Have your signature here and there so I can access a few things temporarily. You don't have to stress about it." Later that day, Marcy from next door dropped by with a vase of daffodils and a story about her cat chasing squirrels. She eyed Brent's architectural sketches spread out on the kitchen counter, but said nothing. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on me longer than usual. I brushed it off. In the afternoon, Brent laid a stack of papers in front of me. "Just the usual authorization forms. Bank junk." I hesitated. "Are you sure this is okay?" He leaned down and kissed my forehead. "Delilah, have I ever let anything happen to you?" And so, I signed. His arms wrapped around me a moment later, lingering in that overly delicate way he'd developed lately, like I was some porcelain doll he needed to protect or control. I couldn't quite tell which. That night, I felt something in my gut, the same ache I felt the day before the accident. But again, I ignored it. The first thing I noticed was the silence, the kind that replaces trust once it's been stolen. Rain ticked against the kitchen window in a rhythm that made the house feel lonelier than usual. Brent had left early again, something about a meeting with the contractor. He didn't kiss my forehead this time. He barely looked at me. I wrapped my sweater tighter and shuffled toward the mailbox, cane clicking against the wet path. The usual grocery ads, a reminder about an upcoming neighborhood meeting, and one envelope from the Social Security Administration. My stomach turned as I tore it open. "Dear Ms. Delilah Mays, this is to confirm the updated designation of your financial representative. All future benefits will be directed to the legally authorized recipient listed below. Brent Mays." I stared at the sentence, blinking. I hadn't authorized anyone. I hobbled back inside, dropped the mail on the counter, and opened my laptop. My SSA portal still recognized my name, but the banking information had changed. I tried calling the helpline, but the wait was over an hour. Instead, I turned to Brent's study and waited for him to come home. When he finally did, soaked from the rain but humming like nothing had happened, I asked, "Why did my benefits letter list you as my representative?" He didn't meet my eyes. "Oh, that! It's just a new filing system. The government's trying to streamline paperwork. Don't worry, it's all for your convenience." My convenience? "Look," he said, dropping his keys a little too forcefully on the counter. "You hate dealing with bureaucracy. This way, I handle it all." He kissed my cheek as if that settled it. It didn't. That evening, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mrs. Mays, this is Marcy Bell with the SSA. I'm following up to confirm your cognitive status for our annual review. We have a note here stating that you were evaluated as mentally incompetent last month by your legal representative." "I'm sorry, what?" There was a pause on her end. "Your representative submitted documentation indicating cognitive impairment. It's standard procedure, but if there's been a mistake, there has." I ended the call gently and sat back, heart hammering. My fingers trembled as I requested the official documentation from the SSA site. 2 days later, the envelope arrived. I read every line slowly, like peeling back layers of betrayal. Brent had written that I suffered from progressive memory lapses, disorientation, and an inability to manage daily finances. It wasn't a mistake. It was premeditated. I stared at my name, printed beneath the words, "mentally incompetent." My hands shook, but not from weakness, from rage. They say betrayal is loud. But for me, it was the quiet click of my walker on the library floor, on the way to plan my comeback. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the McMinnville Community Library, glinting off the polished floors like nothing in the world had gone wrong. I moved slowly between the aisles, passing the local history section and the soft-spoken high schoolers tapping away at keyboards. My hands still trembled slightly, not from my cane, but from anger I hadn't yet figured out how to name. I found a seat near the legal resources section and opened the folder I'd brought. Brent's paperwork, the fake declaration. My name stamped beside lies. I began jotting down phrases in my notebook. SSA, Form 787, State Fiduciary Fraud, Power of Attorney Abuse. Every word I wrote felt like stitching a torn seam closed with thread made of resolve. For a moment, I looked up, my gaze landing on the bookshelf where a few years ago I'd helped a young woman find a farewell to arms for her grandmother. I remembered how lost she'd looked, how grateful when I'd guided her to the right shelf. It had taken me 2 minutes. I hadn't thought about that moment since. I was folding my notes when footsteps approached. A woman in her 30s, red curls tucked under a rain-speckled beanie, smiled gently at me. "Mrs. Mays?" she asked, a hint of recognition in her eyes. "I thought it might be you." I blinked. "Yes?" "It's Marcy Bell, SSAI. I didn't say anything over the phone, but when I saw your name, I remembered. You helped me years ago, here, in this library. My grandma passed that year, but she got to read that book, thanks to you." I let the silence linger, unsure how to reply. Then I nodded, once. Marcy sat beside me. "I pulled your file. It's bad, Delilah, but it's not final. If you'll allow it, I can file a motion to freeze Brent's access while we launch an internal review. But I'll need your signature to represent you as your temporary legal proxy." I stared at the form she laid in front of me. My hand hovered above the paper for just a moment, then moved. My signature wasn't as graceful as it once was, but it was mine. When I looked up, Marcy smiled again. But this time it was fiercer. He played the wrong woman, and I don't think he realizes the strength he just awakened. I realized something. Realized the man beside me was taking actions to deceive, to put me down and take something of my own. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. The only thing thinner than a legal signature is the trust it once stood for. The Social Security Administration office was colder than the spring drizzle outside. Not in temperature, just in the way it smelled of stale coffee and overused carpet, the way the fluorescent lights hummed like a warning. Marcy walked beside me, heels soft against the floor, her file folder held tight like a shield. The lawyer she'd arranged for us was a man named Mr. Halverson, wire-rimmed glasses, crisp white shirt. He shook my hand gently, like he knew I wasn't here for small talk. "We've reviewed the documents Mr. Mays submitted," he began, sliding a packet across the table. "You might want to prepare yourself." Marcy sat beside me, jaw clenched. I flipped the cover page. There, printed in grayscale, was a still frame from a video. Me, in me robe, after a round of painkillers last winter, eyes half-lidded and voice slow. "He submitted this to prove diminished cognitive function," Halverson said. "Out of context, it's compelling. In context, it's a violation." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Each document was worse than the last. The care authorization I'd signed turned out to be a sweeping power of attorney. The forms I thought were routine? They'd given Brent access to my bank account, the SSA portal, and even medical proxies. But the blow that took my breath away came buried in the final envelope, a contract from a property firm. It listed me as the silent investor for a limited liability corporation. 80% stake. My name was typed in bold. Delilah Mays. I stared at it. At my own name was weaponized against me. "He didn't just steal my money," I said softly. "He stole my identity. He made me into the thing that would let him walk away clean." Marcy reached over, steadying my hand with hers. "He's done more than enough to merit legal intervention. We have enough to file for immediate injunction, freeze assets, alert the state, push for emergency hearing." She looked at me with fire in her voice I hadn't seen before. "If he doesn't return everything, we can shut down the restaurant before it ever opens." Brent wanted a grand opening. He got one, just not the kind he imagined. Turkey Rama had always been a noisy affair, frying oil popping, children laughing, announcers hollering through tinny speakers. But that day, the air held a certain tension. Maybe it was the weight of what was about to happen, or maybe it was just me, holding my breath behind a pair of sunglasses and a straw hat. The Blue Fern Bistro booth stood like a polished gem among the fair's rustic chaos. Brent stood under its awning in a tailored navy blazer, flashing smiles to city council members and shaking hands like a man who believed his story would never unravel. The banner read, "Grand Opening. Taste the Dream." I wondered how many people knew that dream had been built on my nightmare. Marcy stood beside me, her file folder tucked under her arm, phone in hand. "The court order is signed. The sheriff's office is here. We wait for the announcement." From behind the stage, I watched Brent hand a comically large pair of scissors to Mayor Delgado. A photographer snapped pictures. The ribbon shimmered. Brent leaned toward the mic. "Thank you, McMinnville, for believing in this dream," he began, voice slick with practiced charm. "This isn't just a restaurant. It's a love letter to community, to resilience." The PA system crackled. A deputy from the sheriff's office stepped forward, flanked by 2 officers. The crowd quieted, Brent Mays, this establishment is subject to immediate closure, the officer declared. Per state order, financial fraud, unlawful power of attorney, and misuse of disability benefits. Murmurs rippled. A woman gasped. Brent's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely as the manager of the booth was handed the suspension order by Marcy. Brent turned toward the crowd, confused. That's when he saw me. I stepped forward, cane in hand, steady as I could. My voice didn't tremble. You wrote me off, but I rewrote the ending. He didn't speak, just stared, lips parted, eyes wild as the deputy read him his rights. Handcuffs clicked. The moment should have felt like victory, but it felt more like silence returning to a house after a storm. As Brent was led away, he looked back over his shoulder. You'll regret this. I didn't flinch. I just turned, one step at a time, walking toward the lemonade stand on Main, where the music had resumed and no one was clapping. Justice tasted better than I imagined, but peace, that was the real dessert. The summer had softened by the time the last chapter of this story came to rest on my porch. The plums had ripened, the air hung heavy with their scent, and the creak of the rocker beneath me sounded more like a lullaby than a lament. Around the table, 4 women, each a decade or two older than me, dipped fountain pens into ink and carefully traced letters across thick parchment. The sounds of concentration were broken only by the soft whistle of the kettle inside. I poured tea into the porcelain cup with a tiny chip near the rim. It had been a gift from Mrs. Ellison years ago after I helped her write a letter to a son she hadn't spoken to in decades. She'd passed that winter, but the cup remained, like a quiet reminder that kindness can echo long after a voice is gone. Marcy arrived with a breezy knock, holding a brown bag of scones and that same warm grin that had become a part of my days. You wouldn't believe the SSA office now, she said, pulling out a chair. They've implemented 2 new safeguards thanks to our case. You're a legend, you know that? I smiled, but didn't reply. There were some things too tender to name. As the group packed up their supplies, a small figure approached the gate. A young girl, maybe 10, with a sun hat too big for her curls. Are you Miss Delilah? She asked, voice shy but steady. My grandma wanted me to give you this before she went. She handed me a small box wrapped in blue paper. Inside was a worn leather notebook and a folded note in brittle script. You gave me dignity when I had none. May it return to you. My breath hitched. For the first time in a long time, the tears came freely. Not from anger or pain, but from something softer. Relief. Gratitude. That evening, I sat at my desk, opened a fresh journal, and wrote a letter to Brent. I never planned to send it. I just needed to lay down the last stone so I could stop carrying it. Later, with the moonlight on my page, I began writing something new. This isn't a story of betrayal. It's a story of becoming. Some betrayals shatter us loudly. Others dissolve us slowly, like ink fading on old paper. For me, healing didn't begin with justice. It began with reclaiming the quiet spaces that had once belonged to me. Kindness, when given freely, leaves behind a trace no deception can erase. And often, it is the softest voices, the ones most overlooked, that speak the clearest truths. If this story touched something within you, take a moment today to offer someone your time, your trust, or simply your tea. Sometimes that's all it takes to remind them they matter.